In the hours before dawn on the 4th of June, 1942, hundreds of young Japanese aviators prepared themselves for what they believed would be another triumphant chapter in their nation's string of victories. Some sat quietly in their cockpits, breathing in the cool Pacific air as it swept across the decks of 4 massive aircraft carriers. Others crowded into briefing rooms below, poring over target photographs and maps one last time, their faces illuminated by dim overhead lights. The maintenance crews worked tirelessly, making final checks on aircraft engines, adjusting control surfaces, ensuring every machine was ready for the coming battle. None of them could have imagined that at that very moment, roughly 240 miles to their northeast, 3 American aircraft carriers were already preparing their own deadly surprise. The Americans were turning into the wind, readying their planes for launch, and within just a few hours, what Japanese commanders had envisioned as the decisive destruction of American naval power in the Pacific would transform into the most devastating defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever experienced. 4 carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor would be reduced to burning wrecks before sinking beneath the waves, carrying with them not merely tons of steel and aviation fuel, but the irreplaceable expertise of more than 3,000 trained sailors and airmen, along with Japan's hopes for Pacific dominance. This moment represented the culmination of half a year of seemingly unstoppable Japanese military success, and for the first time, this critical engagement would be examined through the lens of those who suffered defeat: the Japanese admirals who conceived the operation, the pilots who executed the attacks, and the sailors who perished in the flames. 2 months before this catastrophe, in the spring of 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the combined fleet, found himself engaged in intense debates with the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. Despite the public perception of continued Japanese success, troubling realities haunted military planners. The December attack on Pearl Harbor, while achieving tactical brilliance in many respects, had completely failed in its primary objective of destroying American aircraft carriers. This failure consumed Yamamoto's thoughts. The Enterprise and Lexington had been at sea during the Pearl Harbor strike, and in the 6 months since, these carriers had repeatedly attacked Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. Even worse, on April 18th, American B-25 bombers that had somehow launched from the carrier, Hornet, had appeared over Tokyo itself. The Doolittle raid inflicted minimal physical damage, but the psychological impact within Japanese leadership was profound. The sacred homeland, which the military had vowed to protect at all costs, had been violated, and someone needed to accept responsibility for this humiliation. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor operation, felt particularly vulnerable to criticism. He had been condemned for not authorizing a 3rd attack wave at Pearl Harbor, for failing to locate the American carriers, and now Tokyo had been bombed on his watch. The pressure for some decisive action to restore confidence became overwhelming, yet Japanese high command remained characteristically divided on the proper course forward. Within the corridors of military power, 2 competing strategic visions emerged. The Naval General Staff, conservative in their thinking and cautious by nature, advocated continuing the southern advance, consolidating territorial gains in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea while severing the supply lines connecting America and Australia. Yamamoto, however, harbored a fundamentally different vision, one born from both perceived opportunity and growing desperation. Yamamoto understood something that few others in Japanese leadership truly grasped. Time worked against Japan, not for it. His years in America, studying at Harvard and serving as a naval attaché, had provided him with first-hand knowledge of American industrial capacity. He had witnessed the massive steel mills of Pittsburgh, the sprawling shipyards at Newport News, the seemingly endless agricultural lands that could sustain millions of factory workers. Once America's industrial war machine achieved full production capacity, Japan would inevitably be overwhelmed by pure material superiority. In a documented conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye from 1940, Yamamoto had stated his position clearly. If ordered to fight America, he could guarantee fierce resistance for the first 6 months, but he possessed absolutely no confidence about what would happen if the war continued for 2 or 3 years. This prediction would prove eerily accurate. In another verified statement from September 1941, he had warned that Japan would initially spread in every direction like an octopus extending its tentacles, but this advantage would last perhaps a year and a half at most. Yamamoto's proposed solution was Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll. These tiny islands, comprising barely 6 square miles of coral and sand, possessed strategic value far exceeding their physical size. Situated 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway functioned as America's westernmost outpost, serving as a crucial refueling station for submarines and aircraft patrolling the Central Pacific. More importantly, from Yamamoto's perspective, Midway would function as irresistible bait that would compel American carriers to sortie from Pearl Harbor. When they arrived to defend the atoll, the superior Japanese fleet would destroy them in the decisive engagement that Japanese naval doctrine had always anticipated. The concept was complex, perhaps excessively so, involving multiple forces operating across thousands of miles of ocean, an invasion fleet to capture Midway, a carrier strike force to eliminate American air power, a main body including battleships with Yamamoto's flagship, the mighty Yamato, and even a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands designed to confuse the Americans. Nearly 200 ships in total, the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled for a single operation. The operation order itself exceeded 700 pages, distributed to subordinate commanders only days before departure, giving them minimal time to study and understand it properly. Opposition to Yamamoto's plan existed but ultimately proved ineffective. Rear Admiral Motomi Ugaki, serving as Yamamoto's chief of staff, conducted war games in early May that produced disturbing results. During these tabletop exercises, American carriers appeared earlier than anticipated and inflicted serious damage on the Japanese fleet. These results were simply overruled by the umpires, who arbitrarily reduced American hits and refloated Japanese ships that had been sunk during the simulation. When Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, expressed concerns about the operation's excessive complexity and the vulnerability of the carriers, his objections were dismissed. The phenomenon some would later call victory disease, that fatal overconfidence bred by 6 months of easy conquests, had infected even the most intelligent minds within the Imperial Navy. Japanese intelligence believed they had sunk 2 American carriers during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, when in reality only the Lexington had been destroyed. They assumed the Yorktown was so severely damaged she would remain out of action for months, unaware of the frantic repair efforts at Pearl Harbor, where 1,400 workers labored continuously for 3 days to patch her up, achieving what Japanese shipyards could never have accomplished. Japanese planners calculated the Americans could field at most 2 operational carriers to oppose them. The man selected to lead the carrier strike force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, harbored profound doubts about the operation. Nagumo was not a carrier admiral by training or temperament. He was a torpedo specialist who had been appointed to command the First Air Fleet more through seniority than expertise in naval aviation. He had never been entirely comfortable with carrier operations. At Pearl Harbor, his cautious nature had prevented a 3rd strike that might have destroyed American fuel storage facilities and repair installations. Now he was being ordered to lead an even more ambitious and complex operation with an increasingly exhausted force. His carriers had been continuously at sea since Pearl Harbor, striking Darwin and Ceylon, supporting operations from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. His air crews were fatigued, and the ships desperately needed maintenance. Most troubling, the recent Battle of the Coral Sea had cost Japan dearly in ways that weren't immediately apparent. While tactically a Japanese victory with the sinking of the Lexington, strategically it represented a setback. The carrier Shokaku had been severely damaged and would require months of repairs, while her sister ship Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and pilots that she couldn't participate in the Midway operation. Two of Japan's finest carriers would be absent from what was supposed to be the decisive battle. As Nagumo confided to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, they were being asked to accomplish too much with insufficient resources. The Americans had been given time to prepare, their pilots were exhausted, and Japanese intelligence had no clear picture of American carrier locations. Yamamoto was gambling with the Empire's fate. Perhaps the most fatal flaw in the Japanese plan involved intelligence and fundamental assumptions. Unknown to Japanese planners, the Americans had broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code. Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysis unit, Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, had been reading Japanese communications since early 1942. The Americans knew about Operation MY, knew the target was midway through the famous ruse where Midway broadcast false reports of water shortage via secure cable, and the Japanese subsequently transmitted messages that AF was short on water, and knew the approximate timing of the attack. Admiral Chester Nimitz possessed complete knowledge of the Japanese order of battle and could position his forces accordingly. The Japanese submarine cordon intended to detect American ships departing Pearl Harbor would arrive on station too late. The American carriers had already passed through. The planned reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor by flying boats, Operation K, was cancelled when submarines discovered American warships occupying French frigate shoals, the intended refueling point. This tactic had worked in March when two Kawanishi flying boats refueled from submarines there to bomb Oahu, but Nimitz had learned from that raid and now guarded the location. One by one, the reconnaissance assets that might have warned of the American ambush were being eliminated. Radio intelligence did indicate increased American submarine activity and message traffic around Midway, and the ease with which Americans had located Japanese forces at Coral Sea suggested their codes might be compromised, but these warnings were dismissed by Japanese planners. One staff officer captured the prevailing attitude by stating that Americans were too intellectually inferior to break Japanese codes and too cowardly to fight without overwhelming superiority. They would only come to Midway after Japan had captured it, and then they would be destroyed. On May 27th, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's great victory over the Russians at Tsushima in 1905, Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, departed from the inland sea. 4 carriers sailed, Akagi, meaning Red Castle, Yamamoto's former command, and now Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, meaning Increased Joy, a converted battleship, Hiryu, meaning Flying Dragon, and Soryu, meaning Green Dragon. Between them, they carried 248 aircraft, including 21 Zero fighters being ferried to Midway, leaving 225 operational for combat, crewed by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These were the ships and men who had devastated Pearl Harbor, who had rampaged from Hawaii to Ceylon. Surely nothing could stop them. Commander Minoru Genda, still recovering from his emergency appendectomy but serving as Nagumo's air operations officer despite his illness, reportedly made a final diary entry before departure, expressing heavy hearts about the rushed operation, poor intelligence, and excessive complexity of the plan, though historians caution that Genda's post-war accounts require careful evaluation. The fatal overconfidence pervading Japanese planning was perhaps best illustrated by the situation involving Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. In late May, Fuchida underwent an emergency appendectomy aboard Akagi that left him too weak to fly, depriving the Japanese of their most experienced strike leader at the most critical moment. According to later testimony from other officers, Fuchida watched preparations from his sickbed with growing unease, sensing something fundamentally wrong about the entire operation, though modern scholarship has raised questions about the accuracy of Fuchida's post-war claims. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 3rd, 600 miles to the north, the Aleutian Islands operation commenced. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's 2nd Carrier Strike Force, with the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, launched strikes against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This was intended as the grand diversion, drawing American forces northward while Nagumo attacked Midway. But unknown to the Japanese, the Americans had not been deceived. Admiral Chester Nimitz, fully informed by his codebreakers of the real target, maintained his carriers near Midway. The elaborate deception had deceived no one except the Japanese themselves. Meanwhile, Nagumo's carriers steamed through fog toward their launch point, maintaining strict radio silence that would prevent any coordination between widely separated Japanese forces. In the ready rooms, pilots received their final briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who would lead the first strike, studied reconnaissance photographs of Midway one final time. The images were weeks old, but showed the airfield, fuel tanks, and defensive positions. What they failed to show was recent reinforcement of the island with additional fighters, bombers, and most crucially, the radar station that would detect the Japanese strike while still 93 miles away. That evening, American PBY Catalina flying boats spotted portions of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 miles west of Midway. This first contact electrified American command. Navy pilot Ensign Jack Reed, flying a PBY, transmitted his sighting report. But Nagumo's carriers remained undetected, hidden by weather and distance. On Akagi's bridge, tension was palpable. Chief of Staff Kusaka approached Nagumo expressing concern that if Americans had spotted the invasion force, they might be more alert than expected. Nagumo dismissed the concern, stating the invasion force was supposed to be seen and would draw out American forces. Tomorrow they would destroy Midway's air power, and when American carriers arrived to counterattack, they would be waiting. But even as Nagumo spoke these confident words, 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise was plotting the probable position of the Japanese carrier force. The American carriers were exactly where they shouldn't be according to Japanese calculations, already at sea, already in position, already preparing to strike. Task Force 16 under Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with the hastily repaired Yorktown, had reached Point Luck, their designated rendezvous point northeast of Midway, completely undetected by Japanese reconnaissance. The weather was clear, seas calm, perfect flying conditions with visibility extending for miles. At precisely 4:30 in the morning, Akagi and Kaga began launching the first wave against Midway. The launch proceeded smoothly. 36 Aichi Valdive bombers, 36 Nakajima Kate-level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Lieutenant Tomonaga led them into the lightning sky, circling once over the fleet before heading southeast toward Midway, 240 miles distant. As the 108th aircraft formed up and departed, Nagumo made his first fateful decision of the day. Despite doctrine calling for a full-deck load strike to maximize impact, he held back 108 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. It seemed prudent at the time, but would prove catastrophic. Below decks in Akagi's hangar, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida watched the launch from his sickbed, still recovering from his appendectomy. His absence of experience and tactical genius would be keenly felt in the coming hours. According to witness accounts from other officers, Fuchida expressed deep concern about the operation, though his specific words remain uncertain. The search plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, designated as Scout No. 4 and assigned to search the sector where American carriers actually were located, launched 30 minutes late. Various sources attribute this to catapult problems, though some suggest engine trouble or bureaucratic delays. This single mechanical failure would cascade into catastrophe, though ironically, recent scholarship suggests that had the plane launched on time, its search pattern might have missed the American task forces entirely. At 5:34, PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard Adey spotted the Japanese carriers and transmitted the electrifying message about enemy carriers. He followed with more detail at 5:52, providing bearing, distance, course, and speed. On Enterprise, Spruance made a command decision that would determine the battle's outcome. Despite the extreme range of nearly 200 miles, he ordered an immediate strike. His aircraft would have barely enough fuel to return, but he wanted to catch the Japanese when they were most vulnerable, recovering their Midway strike. Meanwhile, at 5:53, radar on Midway picked up the incoming Japanese strike 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Every available aircraft was scrambled, bombers to attack the Japanese fleet, fighters to defend. Marine fighters launched into the air, 20 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and 7 Grumman Wildcat fighters. They were outnumbered 4-1 by the escorting Zeros. The interception occurred at 6:16. Marine Major Floyd Parks, leading the defenders, made his final radio transmission before the massacre began, swift and brutal. The Zeros, with their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots, tore through the Marine formation. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters were shot down and 4 severely damaged. Major Parks was among the dead. The Zeros lost just 3 planes. At 6:30, Tomonaga's strike force arrived over Midway. The dive bombers and level bombers executed their attacks with precision, setting fuel tanks ablaze, destroying buildings, cratering the runway. But as Tomonaga circled to assess damage, he saw something troubling. American aircraft were still taking off from the supposedly destroyed airfield. The runway, while damaged, remained operational. Most importantly, none of the American aircraft had been caught on the ground. They had all been launched before the strike arrived. At 700 hours, Tomonaga radioed Nagumo that there was need for a second attack wave. This message reached Nagumo just as the first American strikes from Midway began arriving. First came 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 Marauder bombers carrying torpedoes. The Zeros assigned to combat air patrols swarmed them. 5 Avengers were shot down, 2 B-26 destroyed. But 1 B-26, nicknamed Susie Q, and piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, made a desperate run directly at Akagi after dropping his torpedo. According to multiple Japanese witnesses, including bridge personnel, the bomber roared down the length of Akagi's flight deck with its gunners strafing and killing 2 sailors. The plane pulled up at the last second, barely clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff ducked for cover. Murray's aircraft sustained over 500 bullet holes and lost hydraulic fluid, but somehow made it back to Midway. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, heavily damaged, actually crashed into the ocean near Akagi's bridge, possibly attempting a deliberate ramming attack. This near miss had a profound psychological effect. As Captain Kusaka would later testify, the Admiral was visibly shaken. To have an enemy plane nearly crash into the bridge felt like a warning from the war gods. More American attacks followed in rapid succession. 16 Marine dive bombers led by Major Lofton Henderson, who would be killed leading his squadron, 15 B-17 bombers attacking from high altitude, 11 Marine Vindicator dive bombers. All were repulsed with heavy losses, scoring no hits, but they kept the Japanese carriers dodging and weaving, unable to conduct flight operations efficiently. At 7:15, Nagumo faced a critical decision. His reserve aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for ship attack, but Tomonaga needed support at Midway, and no enemy carriers had been spotted. After heated discussion with his staff, Nagumo issued the order that would seal his fate, remove torpedoes and load land attack bombs. This violated Yamamoto's explicit orders to maintain readiness for anti-ship operations. Down in the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, chaos erupted. Ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with smaller land attack munitions. Against regulations and safety protocols, the removed torpedoes were stacked in the hangar spaces rather than being returned to the magazines far below. There wasn't time. Bombs were piled near aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere as planes were refueled. As one mechanic, Airman Mori, would later testify if he had survived, the hangar deck looked like a bomb factory where one spark would kill everyone. At 7:28, everything changed. The Tones delayed scout plane, number 4, finally reported sighting what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships, providing bearing and distance. Nagumo immediately signaled asking to ascertain ship types. The response didn't come for 12 agonizing minutes. Meanwhile, the rearming continued, with hangar decks becoming increasingly cluttered with ordnance. At 7:45, another American strike arrived. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMSB 241, led by Major Henderson. The Zeros savaged them, shooting down 8, but the attacks kept coming, forcing violent, evasive maneuvers that prevented flight operations. Nagumo was trapped in an impossible position. His fighters were running low on fuel and ammunition from fighting off continuous attacks. Tomonaga's strike force would return soon, also low on fuel. His decks were spotted with aircraft being rearmed, and somewhere out there were American surface ships, possibly carriers. At 8:09, Tone Scout No. 4 finally clarified that enemy ships were 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo breathed a sigh of relief, no carriers, and continued rearming for a second Midway strike. But at 8:20, another message shattered his composure. The enemy was accompanied by what appeared to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, immediately signaled Nagumo at 8:30 that he considered it advisable to launch an attack force immediately. Yamaguchi, aggressive and decisive, saw the danger clearly. Every minute of delay increased vulnerability. But Nagumo hesitated. His aircraft were in chaos, some armed with bombs, some with torpedoes, many not armed at all. His fighters needed to land and refuel. Tomonaga's returning strike was approaching. To launch now would mean a partial, uncoordinated attack with no fighter escort, violating every principle of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minoru Genda, despite his illness from the appendectomy, was consulted. According to staff officer testimonies, he argued for an immediate launch, stating speed was everything, but Captain Kusaka counselled caution, arguing that if they attacked piecemeal, they would suffer heavy losses for little gain. Better to recover aircraft, properly arm them, and launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine. Nagumo, always cautious, always by the book, sided with Kusaka. They would recover Tomonaga's force, rearm and refuel properly, and then strike with full strength. He signalled all carriers that after completing recovery of aircraft, they would proceed north to engage the enemy. This decision, logical and prudent, yet completely wrong, sealed the fate of the Kido Butai. As Tomonaga's planes began landing starting at 8:37 and were struck below to be refueled and rearmed, the hangar decks became death traps. Fuel lines were everywhere, bombs and torpedoes scattered about, the constant cycling of elevators bringing planes up and down. Safety protocols were completely abandoned in the rush to prepare for launch. No one noticed the first American torpedo planes appearing on the horizon until too late. At 9:20, the first American carrier planes arrived. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Without fighter escort, flying obsolete aircraft at just 100 knots barely above the waves, they bore in against the entire Japanese fleet. The Zeros on combat air patrol, finally with worthy targets after hours of fighting off land-based attacks, descended like hawks on pigeons. The massacre was total. One by one, the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers were shot down. All 15 were destroyed. Of 30 aircrew, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, who would float in the water hiding under his seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold. Not a single torpedo hit. But Waldron's sacrifice was not in vain. The Zeros were all drawn down to sea level, focused on the torpedo planes. At 9:54, 14 Devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Again the Zeros swarmed down. 10 were shot down, 4 escaped. No hits. At 10:00 hours, 12 Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3 attacked, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 10 more shot down, still no torpedo hits. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. It seemed like another slaughter for nothing. On the bridge of Akagi, there was relief, even celebration. The American attacks had been repulsed with terrible losses. Nagumo ordered the strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30. Victory seemed within grasp. But high above, unnoticed with every zero at sea level, two groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, had searched beyond his calculated interception point, gambling his fuel to find the Japanese. He had spotted the destroyer Arashi speeding north after depth-charging the submarine Nautilus and followed its course directly to the Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different direction at the same moment. At 10:20, lookouts on Akagi screamed warnings about dive bombers, but it was too late. With the zeros at sea level, with decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the hangar spaces, the Japanese carriers were perfectly vulnerable. At 10:22, McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,500 feet. Behind him, his squadrons rolled into their attack dives. The rising sun insignia on the carrier decks below grew larger, becoming perfect targets in the crystalline Pacific morning. McCluskey led his bombers against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took his division against Akagi. Almost simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plunged towards Soryu. The Japanese carriers, recovering from violent evasive maneuvers with their decks crowded with aircraft, were caught at their most vulnerable moment. On Kaga, 4 bombs struck in rapid succession. The first 1,000-pounder exploded near the bridge at 10:22, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his command staff instantly. The second struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where fueled aircraft exploded in chain reactions. The third and fourth bombs turned the ship into an inferno. Within minutes, Kaga was a floating torch with ammunition cooking off and aviation fuel creating walls of flame. Akagi took just one direct hit at 10:24 from Lieutenant Best's bomb, but it was enough. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar among 18 aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The induced explosions of the improperly stored ordnance were catastrophic. Torpedoes detonated, bombs exploded, and aviation fuel created an unstoppable conflagration. Bridge personnel report that within 2 minutes, the entire hangar deck was an inferno with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Soryu suffered 3 direct hits in her hangar spaces at 10:25. Leslie's bombers placed their ordnance with deadly precision. 13 Val dive bombers, 3 Zeros, and 4 Kate torpedo bombers on the flight deck were blown apart. Below in the hangars, the stacked torpedoes and bombs created secondary explosions that tore through the ship's vitals. Her captain, Ryosaku Yanagimoto, refused to leave his burning ship. According to testimony of Chief Petty Officer Abe, who was sent to rescue him, Yanagimoto was last seen on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem Kimigayo as flames engulfed the command structure. Only Hiryu, separated from the others by several miles and screened by clouds, escaped. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately prepared a counterstrike, but 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking power had been eliminated in 5 minutes. At 10:58, even as the 3 carriers burned, Yamaguchi launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Following the American plane's return track, they found Yorktown at noon. Despite fierce resistance from Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they scored 3 bomb hits, leaving the American carrier dead in the water, burning and listing. Damage control parties worked frantically, and incredibly, within 2 hours, Yorktown was underway again, making 20 knots. Yamaguchi, aggressive to the end, immediately prepared a second strike. At 13:31, only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros were available, led by Lieutenant Tomonaga. During the morning Midway strike, Tomonaga's left-wing fuel tank had been damaged. Maintenance crews only had time to fuel his right tank. Offered a chance to switch planes, Tomonaga refused, stating every aircraft was needed. He knew it was a one-way mission. His fuel would only last for the attack run. At 14:30, Tomonaga's small force found Yorktown, now making 19 knots after heroic damage control efforts. American fighters tore into the formation. Tomonaga held his course despite his plane catching fire from fighter attacks. According to American witnesses, his burning aircraft maintained its torpedo run until the very last moment, releasing its torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown at 14:45, tearing open her port side and causing a 26-degree list. This time, the damage was fatal. But at 1700 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. 4 bombs turned her into another inferno at 1703. Yamaguchi assembled his crew on the tilting flight deck. According to survivors, he apologized for the defeat, urged them to survive and rebuild a stronger navy, then retired to his bridge with Captain Tomeo Kaku. Both chose to go down with their ship. Their bodies were never recovered. Yamaguchi's final message to Nagumo included an apology for the defeat and hope for the Emperor's fortune in war. He was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Through the night of June 4th to 5th, surviving Japanese ships attempted damage control, but it was hopeless. Soryu sank at 1913 on the 4th with 711 men. Kaga followed at 1925, taking 811 sailors to the sea floor. At 02:25 on June 5th, Yamamoto, still 600 miles away aboard his flagship Yamato with the main body that never engaged, finally accepted reality. He signalled that occupation of Midway was cancelled and ordered withdrawal. Akagi proved surprisingly hard to kill. Despite raging fires, she remained afloat through the night. At 0500 on June 5th, after all surviving crew had been evacuated, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into her hull. She finally sank at 0520, Nagumo and his staff watching from a destroyer as their flagship disappeared beneath the waves. Hiryu, the last to fall, sank at 0910 on June 5th with approximately 392 men still aboard. As the sun rose on June 5th, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force lay on the bottom of the Pacific in water over 17,000 feet deep. With them were 3,057 men. Of these, 2,181 died on the carriers. Akagi lost 267, Kaga 811, Hiryu 392, and Soryu 711. Another 792 died on heavy cruisers when Mikuma was sunk with 700 dead and Mogami damaged with 92 dead after they collided during night operations and were caught by American aircraft. Crucially, only 110 were aircrew. Most pilots were rescued. The greater irreplaceable loss was over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics and flight deck personnel whose expertise had taken years to develop. The survivors picked up by destroyers were immediately segregated from the rest of the fleet to prevent news of the disaster from spreading. They were confined below decks, forbidden to communicate with anyone. The disaster wasn't quite over. On June 6th, the submarine the Fine 168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, found the crippled Yorktown under tow by USS Vireo. Tanabe had been off Midway, providing weather reports, and had watched the morning attacks through his periscope. Now, slipping through the destroyer screen at 3 knots, he achieved what the entire Kido Butai could not. At 13:31, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 2 hit Yorktown, 1 hit the destroyer Hammond alongside providing auxiliary power. Hammond broke in 2 and sank in 4 minutes with 80 dead, many killed by her own depth charges exploding. Yorktown, hit by 2 more torpedoes, was doomed but refused to sink immediately. She finally rolled over and sank at 0701 on June 7th in approximately 16,650 feet of water. This small consolation, sinking the carrier that had helped destroy the Kido Butai, barely registered against the scale of Japanese defeat. Meanwhile, the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, attempting to bombard Midway on the night of June 4th, had collided while avoiding submarine attack. American aircraft found them on June 6th. Mikuma was sunk with 700 hands, the highest death toll of any Japanese ship at Midway. Mogami, heavily damaged with 92 dead, barely made it back to Truk. The disaster was complete. The journey home was one of shame and silence. Wounded sailors from the carriers were kept isolated in special compartments. No one was allowed to speak of what happened. When the fleet returned to Japan at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14th, they anchored at night to avoid observation. The wounded were offloaded in darkness, classified as secret patients, and taken to isolated naval hospitals, where they were kept under virtual arrest, quarantined even from their own families. They were forbidden any contact with the outside world. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, they were treated in an appalling manner as disgraced losers. The survivors of the air groups were immediately reassigned to distant bases in the South Pacific without being allowed to see families or friends. The majority would die in subsequent battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. The carrier crews were dispersed to different ships and bases, sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. The systematic cover-up began immediately. The government prepared its propaganda. The sunken carriers Akagi and Hiryu remained on the official roster as operational to maintain the fiction they still existed. No flag officers were court-martialed or even officially reprimanded, as this would require admitting defeat. Information about the defeat was withheld from the Imperial Japanese Army. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was kept in the dark about the full extent of the disaster. On June 5th, while the ships still burned, Tokyo Radio announced to the Japanese people that naval and air forces of the Empire had succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added that Japan had achieved another smashing victory with 2 American carriers sunk. The loss of one carrier, Kaga, was eventually acknowledged, with Soryu's loss admitted later. Akagi and Hiryu's destruction would not be publicly acknowledged until after the war. The Japanese people celebrated in the streets, unaware they were cheering a catastrophe. It wasn't until June 10th that the Tokyo press first hinted at problems, using vague language about difficulties in operations while still maintaining the fiction of overall victory. Commander Fuchida, recuperating in hospital from his appendectomy and burns received during Akagi's destruction, was visited by a naval intelligence officer who warned him he was forbidden to speak of what happened. As far as the world knew, Japan had won a great victory. According to post-war accounts that must be treated cautiously given questions about Fuchida's reliability, he responded with bitter irony about the futility of building war on lies, though this exchange cannot be independently verified. Admiral Yamamoto returned to his cabin aboard Yamato and didn't emerge for 3 days. His staff heard him pacing at night, tortured by his failure. To his diary, he confided thoughts that would only be discovered after the war. According to staff officers who served with him, Yamamoto fell into deep depression, knowing the war was now unwinnable. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoye had proven prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for 6 months, exactly as he had foreseen. Now at Midway, occurring precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. In a private meeting with his staff, documented by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto was brutally frank. He had gambled and lost. In trying to destroy American carriers, he had lost Japan's own. The war was not lost yet, but he feared he had lost the means to win it. To his close friend, Rear Admiral Teikichi Hori, he would later write a letter that survived the war, stating the defeat at Midway was not a matter of bad luck or enemy superiority in numbers, but the result of Japanese overconfidence and poor planning. They had underestimated American capabilities and overestimated their own. Now they would pay the price for their hubris, and he gave Japan perhaps 18 months before the situation became completely hopeless. His prediction would prove optimistic. Within 18 months, Japan would lose the Marianas and American B-29 bombers would be within range of the home islands. The true cost of Midway extends far beyond the 4 carriers and 3,057 dead. Japan lost over 100 of its best pilots, men with years of training and combat experience from China to the Indian Ocean. The pilot training program, which took 2 years minimum to produce a combat-ready aviator and far longer to create an expert, could not replace them. More critically, the 700-plus skilled aircraft mechanics, armourers, and flight deck crew who died represented institutional knowledge that took decades to develop. These men knew every rivet of their aircraft, every quirk of their carrier's operations. As Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary, later captured and translated, they could build new carriers in 2 years, but couldn't build new pilots with the experience of those lost, and would never replace the skilled maintenance crews who knew how to keep aircraft flying under combat conditions. The real tragedy of Midway was not the ships, but the men. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea 2 years later, in June 1944, inexperienced Japanese pilots would be massacred in what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviators flying against veteran American pilots in superior aircraft lost over 600 planes while inflicting minimal damage. The seeds of that disaster were planted in the waters off Midway. Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion. Within Imperial General Headquarters, reality slowly sank in despite the propaganda. Planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii were quietly cancelled. The proposed Operation FS to cut supply lines between America and Australia was abandoned. Instead, Japan was forced into a defensive war it could not win. The Americans, their confidence soaring, began planning their counter-offensive. Guadalcanal, just 2 months away, would begin the long, bloody American advance toward Japan. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated since the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, was shattered forever. As one destroyer captain, Commander Tamichi Hara, recalled in his memoirs, after Midway they never felt confident again. They went into battle expecting to lose while Americans went in expecting to win. The whole psychology of the war had changed in those 5 minutes when their carriers were hit. Within the Navy itself, bitter recriminations began immediately, though never publicly. Admiral Nagumo, made a scapegoat for the defeat despite following orthodox doctrine, was relegated to shore duty. He would never command carriers again. In 1944, during the American invasion of Saipan, where he commanded ground forces, he committed suicide rather than face capture. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary that Nagumo was finished as a commander. The blame must fall on someone, and it could not be Yamamoto. The defeat also exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese military culture. The inflexibility of thinking, the inability to adapt to unexpected situations, the blind adherence to doctrine even when circumstances changed. All these cultural traits that contributed to the defeat were recognized but could not be changed. The same rigid hierarchy and thinking that led to disaster at Midway would be repeated again and again throughout the war. Post-war analysis revealed the cascade of failures that led to disaster. The Japanese operation was too complex, with forces scattered across thousands of miles, unable to support each other. Radio silence, maintained religiously, prevented any coordination when plans went awry. Intelligence was abysmal. The Japanese had no idea American carriers were already at sea, while Americans knew every detail of Japanese plans thanks to their code breaking. The failure of reconnaissance was particularly damning. Only 7 search planes to cover a vast ocean area compared to over 30 American PBY's Catalinas. The cancelled Operation K reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor due to American presence at French frigate shoals. The submarine cordon arriving too late to detect American carriers leaving Pearl Harbor. The Tone's crucial 30-minute delay in launching its scout plane. Each failure individually might not have been fatal. Together they guaranteed disaster. Perhaps most critically, the Japanese underestimated American capabilities while overestimating their own. They assumed Americans couldn't break their codes, but they had. They assumed Yorktown couldn't be repaired quickly, but she was fixed in 72 hours. They assumed American pilots were inferior, but at Midway American dive bomber pilots proved devastatingly effective. They assumed American carriers would arrive after Midway was captured, but they were waiting in ambush. The damage control failures were equally telling. Japanese carriers with enclosed hangar decks and inadequate firefighting systems became death traps when hit. American carriers with open hangar decks and superior damage control proved far more survivable. Yorktown took tremendous punishment and might have survived if not for the submarine attack. Japanese carriers burned catastrophically from single hits due to poor fuel system design and inadequate ammunition handling procedures. Admiral Yamamoto did not long survive the defeat he knew doomed Japan. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel schedule. P-38. Lightning fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville and shot it down. His death, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that had precipitated Midway, seemed almost poetic justice. Found in the jungle, still strapped to his seat with sword at his side, Yamamoto took to his grave the full knowledge of how Japan lost the war in those 5 minutes at Midway. Before his death, in one of his last letters to a friend that survived the war, Yamamoto reflected with remarkable clarity that at Midway they learned wars are not won by spiritual strength alone, but by intelligence, both kinds, good information and the wisdom to use it properly. They had neither. They were too proud to believe Americans could be waiting for them, too rigid to adapt when plans went wrong, and too arrogant to admit their codes might be broken. Pride went before the fall, and their pride was limitless. The result was inevitable. The greatest irony of Midway was that it achieved Yamamoto's goal just in reverse. It was indeed the decisive battle he had sought, but it was Japan, not America, that was decisively defeated. The carriers he had tried to trap had instead trapped him. The ambush he had planned became the ambush he suffered. The decisive battle doctrine that Japanese naval strategy had been built upon for 40 years was proven correct, but it was the Americans who won it. As documented in Japanese military archives, Yamamoto had genuinely feared American industrial might. In early 1942, he told his staff that a military man could scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It was more a matter of shame for the one smitten. He would rather they made their appraisal after seeing what the enemy did, since it was certain that, angered and outraged, America would soon launch a determined counterattack. At Midway, that counterattack arrived with devastating efficiency. The Americans had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but had turned Japanese strategy against them. The war would continue for 3 more years, but its outcome was effectively decided in those 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. Beyond the strategic implications, Midway was fundamentally a human tragedy. In the waters 325 miles northwest of Midway, 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen died. Young men who had written final letters to their families that morning, who had shared rice and tea for breakfast, who had dreams of victory and home. They died in flames that reached 1,000 degrees, drowned in oil-slicked waters, or were torn apart by explosions that could be heard miles away. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of the few survivors from Akagi's engine room, testified at post-war investigations that the screams of burning men echoed in his nightmares. Still, they couldn't save them. Passages were blocked by fire, ladders melted from heat. They could only listen as they died, their voices calling for water, for death to end their agony. Every night he heard them still. The families back home never learned the truth during the war. They received notices that their sons died gloriously for the emperor in a great victory. Mothers hung gold stars in their windows, proud of their sacrifice, never knowing it was for a defeat that sealed Japan's fate. The truth would only emerge after the war, adding betrayal to grief. Many families refused to believe it even then, so complete had been the deception. Petty Officer Tanaka, who survived Soyuz sinking, recalled the morning before the battle when they were so confident, joking about which American ship they would sink. Yamada said he would sink a battleship. Suzuki claimed he would shoot down 5 American planes. They were both 18 years old. Both died when the bombs hit. Their bodies were never recovered. Sometimes he wondered if they were still down there, standing at their posts, waiting for orders that would never come. Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest in over 17,000 feet of water, their exact locations only recently discovered by deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard and subsequent expeditions. They are war graves, monuments to the price of hubris and the cost of war. The aircraft that once launched from their decks to spread destruction across the Pacific lie crumpled in their hangar bays. The bones of their crews remain at their battle stations, eternal guardians of ships that will never sail again. From the Japanese perspective, Midway represents the moment when dreams of empire collided catastrophically with reality. It was proof that spiritual strength alone cannot overcome material weakness, that courage without intelligence leads to disaster, that rigid thinking cannot adapt to fluid situations. It was Japan's appointment with destiny, and destiny proved merciless. The Midway defeat shattered more than ships and lives. It shattered illusions. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the faith in spiritual superiority over material strength, the belief that determination could overcome any odds, all died with the carriers. In their place came grim recognition that Japan had started a war it could not win against an enemy it had fatally underestimated using strategies that modern warfare had rendered obsolete. Yet from the ashes of defeat came a different Japan, one that renounced war, embraced democracy, and became a force for peace and prosperity. The samurai spirit that once drove conquest now drives innovation. The nation that once sought to dominate the Pacific now helps maintain its peace. The technological expertise that once built carriers now builds cars and computers. In that transformation, perhaps the 3,057 who died at Midway did not die entirely in vain. The battle also stands as a warning to all nations about the dangers of overconfidence and rigid thinking. The Japanese military, despite its tactical brilliance and brave personnel, fell victim to its own success. Victory disease. The assumption that what worked before will always work, that the enemy will act as expected, that superior spirit will overcome material disadvantage, infected decision-making at every level. The same Navy that had brilliantly executed the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier now bungled basic reconnaissance, ignored intelligence warnings, and walked into a trap that should have been obvious. As we look back at Midway from the Japanese perspective, we see not villains but human beings caught in the terrible machinery of war. Young pilots who flew to their deaths with courage if not wisdom, commanders making decisions with incomplete information under impossible pressure, mechanics working frantically to prepare aircraft they would never see again, sailors fighting fires that could not be controlled, staying at their posts until the end. Their story deserves to be told not to glorify defeat or war, but to remember the cost of military aggression and the price of imperial ambition. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, despite questions about his post-war reliability, perhaps captured something essential when he became a Christian evangelist after the war and spent his remaining years preaching reconciliation. Though his specific accounts must be treated cautiously, his transformation from architect of Pearl Harbor to advocate for peace represents the journey Japan itself took, from aggression to pacifism, from empire to democracy, from isolation to international cooperation. The lesson of Midway from the Japanese perspective is ultimately that no nation, no matter how powerful, can afford to underestimate its enemies, overestimate its capabilities, or ignore the changing realities of warfare. The same carriers that had seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor proved fatally vulnerable at Midway. The same pilots who had swept all before them met their match in American dive bombers. The same strategies that had worked against divided enemies failed against a united and informed opponent. In the end, the waters that closed over the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waters that would eventually wash away the militarism that sent them there. The young men who died believed they were fighting for their emperor and empire. They could not know they were actually dying for the birth of a new Japan, peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. Their sacrifice, though tactically meaningless and strategically disastrous, helped demonstrate the futility of military aggression and the impossibility of sustaining empire through force. This is the Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective, a story of pride before the fall, of human error compounding into catastrophe, of young lives sacrificed for strategic miscalculation. It's a story that deserves to be told not to celebrate defeat or victory, but to remember the cost of war and the price of empire. For in the end, the waves that closed over the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waves that would eventually wash clean the stains of militarism, leaving behind a nation transformed and a lesson for all humanity, that the path of aggression leads only to destruction, and that true strength lies not in conquest but in peace. The ghosts of Midway, Japanese and American alike, remind us that war is not glorious but terrible, not triumphant but tragic, and that peace, however difficult to maintain, is always preferable to even the most decisive victory. In the vast Pacific, where the carriers still lie in their deep graves, the only sound is the eternal movement of the waves, carrying neither Japanese nor American voices, but simply the echo of humanity's costliest lesson, that war, no matter who wins, leaves only loss in its wake.